At 12 years old, I was already riddled with PTSD and severe anxiety. Seeing a therapist twice a week did nothing to stop my extreme paranoia that someone was following me home from school, that someone may be watching me in my bedroom, that someone may be trying to take me from my front yard. My mom raised 3 children by herself. My older brother was in high school, my younger brother in elementary, and I walked 3 blocks to the middle school just down the street from our house. Always the rather safe than sorry type of parent, my mom insisted that I walk with 2 other girls who lived on my street. As middle schoolers want to do, we meandered on the way to school and cut through yards and parking lots to spend the most time gossiping. We often split through a church's parking lot if we were in a hurry, usually thrush with cars in the morning and afternoon from the preschool in the back. It wasn't unusual to see the same cars every day on our way to school, and again on our way back. The other girls thought nothing of it, but I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched on our trek home. In the winter months of my 7th grade year, we used our shortcut nearly every day. The preschool was shut for renovations, so the icy parking lot was empty and perfect for throwing snowballs or sliding around on patches of ice. Only a few cars regularly lingered in the front of the building, except one white pickup truck that was parked in the back. Every time I saw it, the hair on the back of my neck would just stand up. Every morning and afternoon, a man would be sitting in the driver's seat of the truck, looking out the window and watching us walk. I told my mother the first time I saw him. Knowing I was prone to panic, she brushed it off and told me he must just work at the church. The second time I brought it up, she gave me a pink canister of pepper spray and told me to use it first and apologize later. I gripped it in my cold hand every day after that, whenever we passed the man in his truck. I described him to my mother in detail as well. A few weeks after we'd seen the truck for the first time, we crossed the lot after school and found it empty this day. I breathed the fresh breath, putting my pepper spray back in my bag and kicking up powdery snow out of relief. That joy died, though, when I turned down my street and saw the car parked in a driveway just 5 houses down from mine. I sprinted home, locked the door behind me, and counted the minutes until my mother would come home from work. When I finally did, I berated her with questions. Who was the man? Did he live there? What did she know? But my mom's answers were short and nondescriptive. As a single mother, she didn't mingle much with the neighbors and seldom had time to inquire about who lived where. She did know that the couple who owned the house where the pickup sat had a deranged son who had been sent to a mental hospital after an incident when he was 14. I was instantly filled with fear. I closed the curtains to my window before the sun had even set that night, and before I went to bed, I locked every window and door in the house. I was convinced that this insane man who watched me walk to school was going to kill me. When I finally did fall asleep that night, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of our doorbell being pressed repeatedly, almost as if someone was leaning on it. I looked across the hall, and my mother was standing in her doorway, face as white as a sheet. I scampered across the hall and held my little brother tightly as my mom went to the door. Without opening it, she shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" There was no reply, only the sound of the doorbell. Through the peephole, she saw the man who drove the truck parked 5 houses down. She shouted, "I'm calling the police," and dialed 911 on her phone. The ringing stopped and was shortly replaced by banging, as if the man was trying to break the door down. Red and blue lights flooded our street, and the man ran off through the streets. The police didn't chase him, instead parking in our driveway. They asked my mother if she had told him to go away. Panicked and crying, she told them she hadn't, and they said there was nothing they could do. She asked to file a restraining order, but they said there was no way to know for sure it was the man down the street. I told them the license number of the truck that was parked in the church's lot, and that the man who drove it was the same man my mom saw ringing our bell. The police wrote it down, but didn't seem very interested. After about 20 minutes of asking questions, they left and advised we lock our doors. My mother Googled the last names of the couple down the street and found out their son had been discharged at the same time the truck started showing up in the lot. He had been arrested for raping two 12-year-old girls when he was 14 years old, and it was determined that he suffered from a mental disability. He was sentenced to serve 30 years in a mental hospital and then be put on parole. We moved after that. To this day, I'm still convinced he was trying to kidnap me that night. Let's not meet again. So, this is hardly as terrifying as some of the stories I read on here, and I apologize if it's a bit anticlimactic, but it's been on my mind a lot lately, even though it happened years ago when I was only 18. I told my friends, who found it hilarious, but I just thought it highlighted how raising young girls to always be unfalteringly compliant and polite to their elders isn't always necessarily a good thing. I'm a woman in my mid-20s now, living on a farm in rural England, and I like to go jogging around the local area, especially along a nice 5-kilometer stretch of canal. This was the only time I ever had a creepy experience, and thankfully, or perhaps foolishly, it didn't deter me from running my favorite route even after the incident. Perhaps I should also preface this by saying that I have, zero street smarts. None. Zilch. I've lived in the countryside my entire life, and while it has its own dangers and shortcomings, the worst I've really had to deal with are people trespassing on the farm, who are terribly British and move along usually without too much fuss. Everyone, myself included, apologizing for being an inconvenience. So far, I think I've just been extremely lucky in that I haven't encountered anyone especially nasty. Anyway, though, before I go off on a tangent, I remember that it was raining on this particular day because I was really struggling to not slip in the mud and go straight into the canal. It must have been about 30 minutes into the run when I noticed a man fishing up ahead. I've always loved fishing myself, and as I was jogging past him, his head snapped up. I assumed because he didn't hear me approaching on account of the rain. I shot him a smile and wave as I usually do to the people who I passed by on a run. I didn't really notice anything weird about him, just some old gentleman in a green raincoat looking startled from a jogger. Anyway, literally a second later, I tripped over his spare pole. Not a euphemism, I promise. It was just laying there in the grass, and I wasn't watching my feet for a split second, but luckily I didn't fall flat on my face. I just stumbled a bit. I can't remember what he said that got me to stop. Something like, "Whoa, are you alright?" Maybe it's testament to how unfit I was at the time, but I actually welcomed the excuse to stop and catch my breath, so I turned around and said, "Oh God, don't worry, I'm fine, just a bit clumsy." Writing this out, I'm starting to see how there were 1,000 things I could have done to avoid this situation. I think I opened a window to conversation by asking him what he was catching, if he was having a successful day so far and enjoying the weather. We got to talking, and he was perfectly pleasant, mentioning how he was retired. Fishing was his hobby, and this was his first time in the area. I did notice that every now and then, his eyes kept wandering down to my legs, but frankly, if I'm talking to someone, my gaze often flits around without me realizing I'm doing it as well, so I didn't really think too much of it at first. Then he started to tell me about how his wife had left him, an out-of-the-blue statement. I mean, we were literally talking about how annoying crayfish can be for fishermen, but never mind. I offered my condolences, and he presses on about how his kids don't ever see him. He's so lonely and doesn't have a lot of joy in his life. He pauses at this point and asks if I have a partner. I honest to God say no and make a joke about reeling one in someday, but he doesn't laugh. I have to be real with you guys. I didn't see a thing wrong with his odd line of question. No red flags at all. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, I suppose. This old man does that thing where he starts listing off reasons why I should have a boyfriend. Any man would be lucky to have me, blah blah blah. I'm so nice and articulate. How am I single? At last, at long last, I falter. But I think it had more to do with the fact that I've always been awful at receiving compliments honestly. I'm a bit shy and start making jokes, so I said I'll most likely be single because I'm a terrible cook. He immediately counters, I happened to be a chef when I was a young man. We'd be the perfect couple. Ah, I thought. He then offered me some sweet corn he'd cooked himself. The same sweet corn I've been watching him use as bait for the last 10 minutes, mind you. At that point, he had me on the retreat. I wasn't exactly scared of him, just a bit put out that a seemingly harmless conversation had taken such a sudden and unwanted turn. So, thank God, I actually had some semblance of a brain in there. I declined the offer for waterlogged sweet corn bait and mentioned that I was expected home for lunch. He asked if I live in the village just up the road. Well, it's the only village for miles, so duh. What else could I say but yes? I waved and said goodbye, but before I could leave, he reached out and grabbed my hand, saying, Before you go, you've been so kind stopping to chat with me. Not everyone would do that, you know. Would you mind if I asked for a kiss before you leave? And damn me, this is the part of the story where my poor suffering mother buries her face in her hands and asks me what in the world went through my tiny brain in this moment. I said okay. I didn't want to. I didn't like the question, but the way I figured we always kiss our elderly relatives on the cheek as either hello or goodbye, I thought he meant something like that, a kiss in parting. Not an altogether weird thing to do in the UK. Admittedly odd to do with a perfect stranger, but I was always raised to be as accommodating as possible. I wouldn't say boo to a goose, because if I ever raised my voice as a child, I was swiftly admonished for behaving so childishly. I love my parents deeply and unequivocally, but I wish they'd taught me to say no just a little more often, and more so to say no without feeling guilty afterwards. He stands up, and I lean around him, ready to press my cheek against his. This old twat grabs my chin, jerks my face forward so I literally crash into his lips, and he just sort of sucks on my bottom lip for all of a second before I lurch back and stare at him like I didn't just walk right into that one. On a side note, I noticed there was white stuff gathered on the corner of his lips, and I couldn't help myself. I gagged rudely and loudly, but to be honest, I think it was justified. He looked offended at that, but I didn't stick around to ponder on that sort of hypocrisy. Stammering something about how I hope he enjoys the rest of his day, I pelted it along the canal. I heard him call out, "Where are you going?" as if my hasty retreat was a complete mystery to him. I got home and told my mom, expecting her to laugh it off with me because what the hell, right? She was righteously furious and lectured me on how I should have just said no in the first place. I didn't feel like debating the irony of her telling me that. She also made me promise not to go running along that canal again. I kept my promise for just about a week. I got good marks at school. Doesn't mean I was that smart, though. Luckily, I never did end up seeing him again, and frankly, I hope I never do. Every summer with a few friends, we take a trip to the seaside of France for just about a week. Well, last year we decided to go to Hossegor on the southwestern coast to go surfing, but ended up in a small touristic village called Molliet-et-Ma, an hour from where we were supposed to go because of a reservation mess-up. The week was going okay until the last 3 days of the trip, but the story I'm going to tell you is of the last night. So, the past 2 days we'd been in trouble with the police, and a few other tourists because of some misunderstandings over a pack of cigarettes. We had spent the last 2 nights stressing and trying to cool things off, and therefore we thought the last night we spent there couldn't possibly be as bad as those 2. It couldn't possibly be, as we were leaving the next day very early in the morning, so we had only planned to go to a restaurant for dinner with some friends we had met there to celebrate the trip. The dinner was going great. We were all having fun, and as time passed by, it started to get a bit dark. Towards the end of the meal, my best friend Dennis, who was driving us home the next day, thought it was best for him to leave early and not drink too much, so he could sleep as soon as possible and be in the best shape for the long drive that was coming. He left about 15 minutes before the rest of the group, while we stayed and drank a bit more. We paid the check, and as soon as I got up from my chair, I received a sudden message from Dennis. "Hey, call me. There's a guy following me." Here's what happened. Dennis had to pass through a caravan parking lot and a golf to get back to the residence in which we had rented a house. While he was in the parking lot, he noticed someone behind him that was about his size, 1 meter 70 centimeters, with a hood and cap on. At first, he didn't think anything of him, as the village was actually quite touristic and there were a lot of people usually passing by this lot. But when Dennis stopped to pee on a tree, he had a glimpse of the man behind him stopping as well, hiding behind another tree just a few feet back. And as soon as he got walking again, the man stepped out from behind the tree and started following him again up to the golf. As Dennis got there, he was a bit creeped out, especially since at night it's completely dark, only lit by the moonlight, and completely devoid of people. He stopped again for a second to light a cigarette and check if the man was still behind him. Once again, the man stepped out of the path and hid behind a tree until Dennis began to walk again. That's when he understood. He was in danger. The man wasn't physically imposing, and so Dennis thought it was weird he was so confident in following him. Maybe because he was holding onto a knife or a gun. Nevertheless, Dennis kept walking and acting as if he hadn't noticed anything, although the man kept following him very closely, and that's when he sent me the message. As soon as I picked up, he talked loudly to try and scare the man off by saying, "Hey, you're at the golf with the other 8, right? No problem, I'll be there right in a minute," even though we were 5 and absolutely not there, which was terrifying for me, but it was clever because it made me understand he wasn't joking and where he was. I swore to him that everything was going to be okay, that I would be there in 5 minutes, and told him to be careful and safely try to go home. As soon as I hung up, I started running towards the golf and explained very briefly to my friend that Dennis was in trouble. We had to get there as soon as possible. Meanwhile, when I hung up, Dennis put the phone back in his pocket and kept walking. He took a glance back and saw the man was now only a few meters behind him. He took a last puff of the cigarette he had lit 2 minutes before, then threw it to the ground and began sprinting towards the residence. As he started to run, he took a glance back and saw the man had started sprinting as well. It lasted for about 5 minutes before he got in front of our house, which was completely empty. When he got there, he stopped for a second, looked back one last time. The man was only about 10 meters behind him, in the middle of the alley, immobile. He then went to hide behind one of the cars that were on the side of it. As soon as Dennis saw that, he panicked, barged into the house, locked the door with a bit of difficulty, and grabbed the biggest knife he could. He waited on the couch facing the entrance, which was a glass canopy. When my friends and I got there, he was extremely scared, but thankfully unhurt. He explained everything to us, and then we went looking for the man in a group of 4. The neighbors hadn't seen anyone other than us, though, and even though we got to the residence at first in separate groups, at different times and through 2 different entrances, we'd never seen anyone coming out of them. He had just completely disappeared. Nothing was stolen even though we had left clothes to dry outside of the house, and nobody was hurt either. So we didn't call the police but warned the neighbors, and me and 2 others stayed up all night outside to look for the man, as he had seen where we lived and we were afraid he would return during the night whilst we were all asleep. Dennis had been lucky. He never knew what were the intentions of this man, or if he was hiding something that gave him the advantage in a fight. Furthermore, he didn't even try to get into the house, and good for Dennis, because there was another entrance as well, another glass canopy that led to one of our friends' rooms which had not been correctly closed. We couldn't even understand why he'd done this. If he wanted to steal from Dennis or murder him, he could have done it 2 separate times. First, when he went unsuspectingly to pee, and second, when he lit a cigarette. But he didn't. So, what did he want? Who was he? Where did he go? I don't think we'll ever get any answers. We can only hope he never did anything to anyone and was arrested if he did. We didn't call the cops back then because we had trouble with them the past 2 days because of the problem with the pack of cigarettes I talked about before. Also, after those 3 days that had gone wrong, we just wanted it to end. Go home and sleep. I regret not calling them now that I think about it, but it's way too late now. We were all extremely tired the next day, and the drive that was supposed to be 5 or 6 hours took a long 10 to complete under the heavy summer heat. But we all got home safely, slept well, and never had any problems of that sort ever since. I'm thankful that now we can laugh about it.